Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. With Prime Minister Modi's forthcoming visit to the United States continuing to dominate the news and provoke widespread interest, we present a special discussion between two of the most ambassadors to either country, Robert Blackwell and Meera Shankar. How do they view what's happened and what is their advice to their respective governments? That's in part two. But first, as we await the budget amidst a plethora of leaks about what the government may do, how do India's top industrialists and bankers view the Modi government? What are they hoping for and what do they fear? And joining me now are two of the most important and influential voices from industry and banking in India, the chairman of the Godrej Group and former president of CII, Adi Godrej, and the chairperson India and director Asia Pacific of HSBC Bank and former president of FICCI, Naina Lal Kidwai. Adi Godrej, let me start with a simple question. Has the very fact of Mr. Modi's sweeping victory, his clear, firm hand on governance and his confident start made a significant difference to the investment and industrial climate in the country, with the Sensex shooting above 25,000?
Yes, certainly. I think, one, the fact that there is a majority government for the first time after 30 years means that the political process will be much smoother than in the recent past. Secondly, this government, in particular Prime Minister Modi, is free enterprise oriented, he is entrepreneurship oriented, so people expect policy decisions which encourage investment and growth. And thirdly, I think one of the biggest problems India has suffered from over the last 2 or 3 years has been that the ease of doing business, which has always been rather poor in India, which had actually worsened. And it is expected now that this new government, led by Prime Minister Modi, will improve the ease of doing business in India very considerably. So overall, it can end up attracting tremendous amount of investment, both domestic and international.
Naina Lal Kidwai, how do you assess Mr. Modi's early decisions? I'm talking about the scrapping of GOMs and EGOMs, his 10-point priority, his instruction that all his ministers must prepare a 100-day roadmap for their ministries, and perhaps most significantly of all, his assurance to civil servants that they should work fearlessly and he will protect them. How do you assess all of that?
I think, Karan, if you look at some of the issues which we were seeing over the last couple of years, the problem of decisions not moving forward, of a bureaucracy that had stopped signing off on things because of whatever fears they saw, whether it was to do with CAG or CVC or just pure decision making, I think to restore that confidence, some action was necessary. And the bureaucrats that I've interacted with who were at the session with the Prime Minister have come back feeling very charged up and pumped up, and I think that is what is needed. So clearly, the fact that this government is in decision-making mode, the fact that they are keen to bring the bureaucracy along with their aspirations to deliver on growth, as in the government's aspirations to deliver on growth, are very, very important signals. Needless to say, the expectations that have built up of the government are very high, and I fear maybe too high, in that it isn't easy to deliver given what they have in fact on the table. Issues around the fisc, for example. Can I stop you there? Acting is a given.
Can I stop you there? I'll come to some of those in a moment's time, because that's very much the key and the core of what I want to go into. But first, Mr. Godrej, you talked about the ease of doing business. Now, this government has created what the press has dubbed super ministries, clubbing together coal and power, highways and shipping, finance and corporate affairs. The government has also created what the press calls super ministers of state, entrusting critical ministries to people like Nirmala Sitharaman, Piyush Goyal, Prakash Javadekar, Dharmendra Pradhan. From your perspective, does that give you confidence that the rationalization as well as the choice of ministers is going to ensure delivery, decision making, as well as easy performance of government?
Yes, certainly, because where coordination between ministries is required, they've been actually combined, and that itself should lead to much quicker decision making. But more importantly, the whole concept of group of ministers and EGOMs, etc., has been done away with. So I feel decision making will be much quicker. I also feel that the Prime Minister's office will be very strong in this government, and any difficulties in any of the ministries, despite the improved processes, will be taken care of by the Prime Minister's office very quickly. So I think ease of doing business will certainly improve, and that itself will send an excellent message for investment into India.
Now, Naina Lal Kidwai, the pink papers have already begun to speculate about what the government will do. One of the things that's been talked about is that the government proposes raising FDI caps across the board to 49% with automatic clearance. Some papers are even talking about FDI in defense specifically going up to 100%. If those steps actually happen, how would you respond to them?
Well, clearly anything which brings investment back into India is a positive. But I don't think all that we are looking to rest in and around FDI. I think defense investment is important. We need Indian industry to come forward and invest, to do the manufacturing on the ground, to create the jobs here, and indeed to ensure that the imports which we are seeing in defense are no longer necessary at the levels that they happen. But not all technology is going to be readily available to our Indian groups to do in India or through joint venture. So a policy that is pragmatic and says that, you know, up to 49% is virtually automatic, and beyond 49 will be on a case-by-case basis is absolutely the right way to go, so that we can, at the end of the day, manufacture in India, in Indian hands where possible, and where not, to have 100% FDI in the equipments that are so required. And I think the policy therefore has to be one that enables 100%, but possibly not across the board.
Now, Mr. Godrej, I noticed that on insurance, an area where the BJP in opposition had blocked the UPA's attempt to raise caps to 49, today's Business Standard says that Mr. Modi's government is now planning to raise the level to 49% itself, but with two critical riders. One, voting rights will be restricted to 26%, and secondly, all companies will be required to offer standalone health insurance policies. Would you welcome that, or would you be concerned about those two riders?
No, I think opening up to 49% is certainly welcome. And if you look at voting rights, whether it's 26% or 49%, it's the same in terms of the rights of the shareholder. Because once you have 26%, you can block special resolutions, and 49% doesn't give you any further advantages. So over time, I presume it can go even above 49%.
So this change of heart from the position that BJP adopted in opposition to what is now being suggested a new position in government is one that you warmly welcome. Have I understood you correctly?
That's right.
Naina Lal Kidwai, today's Times of India is speculating about environment clearances, and as you know, those were a major problem right through the 10 years of UPA rule. Industrialists used to grumble about how projects were locked up, investment worth lakhs of crores simply was stuck. Now, today's Times of India says that environment clearances could happen online within a time limit of 60 days. In your eyes, would this be a better solution to that decade-old problem than the UPA's Cabinet Committee of Investment and its project management group clearance process?
Well, I think like with anything, there has to be a sense of balance here, Karan. The concern I would have is that we have a regime where the environment and concerns therein are not addressed adequately. So yes, listing online has the fantastic implication that it is transparent, which is clearly an issue. We want the transparency, and in having the transparency, we need to know applications that go in, why they're not getting approved or why they're stuck. But in according these approvals, we clearly need to protect what is very dear to us as a country. And classic example I would like to give is at coal, where we went from a regime where everything was possible, a go-go regime, to a no-go regime where nothing was possible. And what we really need is something in between which says, yes, you can mine coal even if it is a budding forest, but for everything that is destroyed in the process, you put back 6 or 10 times as much in terms of trees and repair the damage that you do, so that there is a cost to it. Or the way you mine, maybe it isn't all about open face mining, that there has to be other forms of mining as other parts of the world follow. So concerns in terms of the way we do this is as important, and it would be a pity if everything to do with the environment gets thrown out of the window. And I don't believe that will be the case.
Okay.
Because we are hearing from this government that they will push on renewables and that they will have a keen eye on tourism, and tourism clearly benefits from a lot of these environmental concerns around preserving forests and ensuring that we have a clean environment to welcome our tourists.
Now, Mr. Godrej, something that you used to be a sharp critic of right through last year was the decision by the UPA government to retrospectively amend tax laws, and in particular the way that retrospective amendment had applied to Vodafone. It's now being speculated that the new government may very well reverse those retrospective amendments and in fact make them prospective instead. If that happens, and it does require legislation, so we can't be absolutely sure, what impact would it have on FDI flows into India, and in particular what impact would it have on the way foreign investors view this country?
I think it will have an extremely positive effect. I think that was a major mistake in amending those laws retrospectively. But even more than that, after that, there have been a lot of controversies on transfer pricing claims made by the Income Tax Department, which has created a lot of problems. So I think those also need to be attended to. And as what has been termed as tax terrorism needs to end. I think with that, investment into India will rise dramatically. There were many boards which used to say, don't talk about investing in India in the recent past. That will change dramatically. So I think it would be extremely welcome, and it would add tremendously to the prospects of GDP growth in India.
Now, Naina Lal Kidwai, I want to come to that concern you expressed a moment ago about fiscal correctness and fiscal control. The Economic Times recently claimed that Finance Minister Arun Jaitley is determined to ensure that the fiscal deficit is kept in very strict control. And so the paper speculates that progressively we will probably see the diesel subsidy ending, and that 50 paisa cut per month will probably continue. How important a message would that convey regarding Arun Jaitley's approach to his job if these things actually happen?
And I think he's already demonstrated it by saying there will be control on the expenditure side. Very, very important, because if there's one thing that India remains quite vulnerable on, it is our fisc. And the fact that it has been somewhat artificially contained right now at below 4.6%, and that there are many expenses which have carried over to this year. I do believe the markets, and indeed many who watch India, will give time, in that it's impossible to believe that we can slash the fisc overnight. But one clear way of tackling the fisc will be growth, because the revenue side of our equation has had quite a beating by virtue of the growth having come off. So if we can allow growth to come back up, even while we contain expenditure, bring subsidies down as is necessary in diesel, the signals that will go out will be the right ones, that would demonstrate that it is action, but action that is not going to happen at the cost of growth, but recognizing that we will bring the fisc under control, and we'll do it in part by upping the revenue side of the equation.
Now, Mr. Godrej, you heard Naina Lal Kidwai talking there about the importance of pushing up growth, but without damaging the fisc. The problem is that the RBI governor has recently indicated, and Mr. Jaitley clearly seems to have supported him, that inflation is going to remain the key target. And that leads to the conclusion that there's not going to be any early relaxation of interest rates. How disappointed are you by that conclusion?
No, I feel that this government will take some steps in terms of supply side problem solving on inflation. I think together with the fact that global commodity prices are coming down, all indicate that inflation will start reducing, and I think the Reserve Bank will act within the next 3 or 6 months to bring interest rates down. That, I think, should be sufficient. But more importantly, talking about the fisc, I think what is extremely important, that subsidies need to be tackled. I think this government will, and not just petroleum subsidies, but even fertilizer and food subsidies, sensibly tackle them and create a lot of revenue from disinvestment and privatization. I think this government will do that also quite well.
Can I ask you where you get the confidence that subsidies, particularly food and fertilizer subsidies, will be tackled? Because Mr. Modi has never spoken about that, and one of the things Mr. Modi has begun to say after he became Prime Minister is that he is the Prime Minister of India's poor. And many people fear that that is a way of suggesting that he's going to protect some of those welfare subsidies in particular. So where do you get the confidence subsidies will be tackled effectively and perhaps even fairly significantly?
Well, I'm not saying he's not the Prime Minister for the poor, but some of these subsidies just lead to wasteful consumption. They don't really help the people. For example, fertilizer subsidy certainly leads to uneconomic use of fertilizer in many cases. In Gujarat, agricultural growth was 9 to 10% over the period of the Modi regime, not by giving subsidies, but by helping farmers improve their yields on their land, soil testing, etc., etc. And I think those are the steps that will be taken to help agriculture and not just subsidizing people.
Okay. We've begun, Naina Lal Kidwai, to talk about positive measures in quotation marks, reformist type measures that the government could take. Cutting subsidies might well for some come under that rubric. What about GST and DTC? They've been languishing in Parliament for years. UP has been unable to clear them. Do you feel that Arun Jaitley will be better able because he comes from a majority government and because some of the recalcitrant state governments were BJP ones? So do you see greater hope that GST can go through under this government and fairly soon?
I'm quite confident that GST will, because the first few moves have been on that front. There's talk of going out to the states and getting them on side. A lot of it has to do with giving the states the comfort that they will be no worse off. And frankly, I do believe we were already 80% of the way there on getting GST implemented. My hope is that by 2015, we will have a GST regime which can add 2% back into the GDP of the country. It's good for India, and one which I would certainly urge this government to tackle on a war footing, because it will bring much needed growth and will bring a lot of the leakages that have otherwise occurred through tax collection back into the system.
Now, Mr. Godrej, one of the measures that UPA took, which the UPA saw as important and reformist, but which industrialists certainly didn't like, was the land acquisition bill. Most industrialists felt that not only did it make land acquisition very expensive, but it also made it at the same time extremely difficult. Do you think that's a particular nettle that this new government must grasp and grapple with very quickly and hopefully reverse that land acquisition bill?
I don't think the land acquisition bill will be reversed, but I think it will be amended to a certain extent to ensure that land is acquired. The good part about the Land Acquisition Act is that farmers whose land is acquired will be paid in a fair manner. The bad point is the procedural difficulties and time-consuming procedures involved in the act. I think this government will ensure that those parts are adequately either amended or practically overcome by the states acquiring land and then providing it for private purposes and for infrastructure purposes.
But you do believe that this government will amend the land acquisition bill?
I think there will be some changes. I think it will be made more practicable.
Naina Lal Kidwai, there was a certain measure of hope during the latter stages of the campaign before the actual voting started that maybe Mr. Modi was coming around to rethinking the BJP's position on FDI and retail. But he's made pretty clear now by Nirmala Sitharaman, the Commerce Minister, that she at least is going to stick to the manifesto commitment, which is in fact to reverse permission for FDI in retail. If she does stick to that, would you be disappointed?
I think FDI in retail would have been helpful, but in itself it's a very small part of the whole play that is India, and I can't say that I was expecting a step change in that. It's worth a review to the extent that it helps farmers, that it applies and helps backward linkages and improves that supply chain into the retail environment and provision of products to urban India. But I wouldn't worry hugely about this. But Karan, I think there are a couple of important things which I'd like to touch on, and that is the huge push and announcements that were made in the area of water and sanitation, the provision of toilets across the country, electricity and the provision of electricity. And I think if we can improve the lot of every Indian through provision of these very important aspects of progress and growth, water, sanitation and electricity, it is, I think, something which has to be lauded.
Okay.
And these are aspects which have been set out right up front, which we should not ignore.
Now, speaking as an industrialist, Mr. Godrej, I noticed that the BJP manifesto is committed, at least in two separate places, to labour law review as well as labour law reform. How hopeful are you that something that has been a bit of a political bombshell for governments will actually be tackled by this one? Do you really expect labour law reform? And is there a particular measure that you would like to see undertaken quickly?
Yes, I think there will be labour law reform. That doesn't, because I think labour laws today work against employment increase. So the right kind of reform in labour law will add considerably not only to employment, but would add to growth and investment. So the right kind, I don't mean that you should take away rights of labour, but there should be a fair system of tackling labour. We must recognize that industry sometimes does not work out. You need to reduce the labour in a particular factory. It shouldn't need government permission to do so, but it should be a fair compensation for the changes required. I think that kind of labour reform will come. It will be extremely valuable, and I think labour will, or labour unions will also welcome it in the long run.
We have only 1 minute left, Naina Lal Kidwai. Let me ask you one last quick question. Everyone anticipates that Mr. Modi will run a fairly tight ship and that the PMO will be monitoring and supervising ministries and therefore ensuring that there's a constant measure of focus and direction. How welcome would that be after the impression that things were a bit ad hoc and floundering under UPA?
One of the sectors which suffered the most through interministerial issues and to some extent through centre and state issues is infrastructure. And clearing of projects which began to start under the old regime was indeed noteworthy. It started a bit late. Taking forward now, sorting through some of the large infrastructure projects which are stuck is critical. Because if we don't do it, the mounting NPAs in banks becomes a big issue for the banking sector. And I think that single interministerial coordination around power, around roads, around infrastructure generally is very, very critical and can happen through a tighter run ship.
All right, we clearly have two industrialists, a banker and an industrialist, correct myself, who are very optimistic and hopeful, who expect a lot from this government. My thanks to both of you for joining me and explaining how you view the Modi government and what you believe should be its priorities. Time now for a break, but then